Hello, everyone. Today we are going to discuss clauses and phrases. Then we will talk about complex sentences in English. And then we will finally finish by talking about compound complex sentences in English. Now, as you will remember, clauses are a group of words that have a subject and a verb. A phrase is a group of words without a subject and a verb. There are two main types of clauses that we need to be aware of. There are independent clauses, which could be sentences on their own. They are complete thoughts. They have a subject and a verb. Dependent clauses, on the other hand, cannot be sentences on their own. They are not a complete thought. Now that gets really important as we start talking about complex sentences in just a minute, so it's going to be helpful to refresh with some examples. First example, the man went to the store to buy bread and milk. That is an independent clause because it does make sense on its own. It could be a sentence on its own. The next one, although he went to the store, requires a little bit more information. Therefore, it cannot be a sentence on its own, which makes it a dependent clause. Now, a complex sentence is simply a sentence that has both an independent clause and a dependent clause. Here's an example of that. After we watched the basketball game, we went out to ice cream. The first half of that sentence, after we watched the basketball game, is a dependent clause. It does not make sense by itself. We can't just say after we watched the basketball game and stop talking because our listener or our reader needs a little bit more information. But then the second half of that sentence, we went out to ice cream, is an independent clause because that could stand on its own. It has a subject, it has a verb, it is a complete thought. So what we have here is a dependent clause plus an independent clause, which creates a complex sentence. Now, complex sentences can be built in either direction. And what I mean by that is you can have a dependent plus an independent, or you can have an independent plus a dependent. Both of those are still complex sentences. The important thing with complex sentences is figuring out how to punctuate them. Oftentimes, complex sentences provide some interesting punctuation problems for people. Usually we see a lot of punctuation errors with complex sentences because people can't differentiate between the dependent and independent clauses. Here's some examples, though, that might help. First off, it's important to know that if your complex sentence begins with a dependent clause, then you need a comma after that clause. For instance, after we watched the basketball game is a dependent clause and it starts the sentence. So we're going to put a comma right after that dependent clause. As soon as that dependent clause ends, we're putting a comma there. Then we have the rest of the sentence. We went out to ice cream. Now, if we were to reverse the order and we start with an independent clause and end with a dependent clause, we no longer need a comma. Here's an example. This is the exact same sentence. We've just flipped the clauses. So now we are going to start with an independent instead of a dependent. We went out to ice cream. Again, that's an independent clause. Then we have after we watched the basketball game. So we went out to ice cream after we watched the basketball game. We have an independent followed by a dependent. You will notice with this one that there is not a comma between those. And that's where things get tricky. If you start a complex sentence with a dependent clause, you need a comma between the two clauses. But if you start with your independent clause, then you do not need a comma between the two clauses. And that's what can really mix people up. One thing that will help you identify dependent clauses, though, is knowing about subordinating conjunctions. And there are a lot of subordinating conjunctions in English, so it gets kind of tricky. But here's a list of some of the most common ones. After, although, because, before, even though. You can read all of these, but the point with all of these is subordinating conjunctions. What they do is they turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. And they do that by creating cause and effect or sequential relationships. Here's an example. If we return back to our sentence before, we have we went out to ice cream. That is our independent clause. But our dependent clause starts with the word after we watch the basketball game, which you will notice is a subordinating conjunction. What happens with this example is if we just took out the after and said we watched the basketball game, that is an independent clause. That could be a sentence on its own. But as soon as we add in that subordinating conjunction to the beginning of the clause and we say after we watch the basketball game, well, now our reader is going to be looking for extra information because we've created a two-part sentence. After this thing happened, then this thing happened. And because we've created that two-part dynamic, We have therefore created a dependent clause because it no longer makes sense by itself. So when we look at these subordinating conjunctions, what we are looking at is words that are going to force our sentences to have two halves to them. Since I was hungry, comma, I ate dinner. Although I was tired, comma, I still stayed up late, period, right? So what we're doing with these subordinating conjunctions is creating two halves to our sentences. Now, if you are familiar with some of these conjunctions, you'll be able to identify dependent clauses. But even if you aren't familiar with them, you can still identify a dependent clause by determining whether or not it makes sense on its own. Now that leads us into compound complex sentences, which is the last type of sentence that we will discuss. A compound complex sentence is a sentence that has more than one independent clause and it has a dependent clause. In other words, it is a compound sentence that has been combined with a complex sentence. Here's an example. Although I was hungry, I decided to skip breakfast and I regretted it all day. This is all one sentence, but we start out with a dependent clause, although I was hungry. That does not make sense by itself. It's not a complete thought, therefore it is a dependent clause. We then have, I decided to skip breakfast. That is an independent clause. It can stand on its own. And then finally we have, I regretted it all day. Now you will notice, based on what we've talked about in this video and then in past videos, we have combined those clauses correctly here. So we have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. In that situation, we need a comma between the two. Therefore, we put a comma after hungry. But additionally, we have two independent clauses, right? We have, I decided to skip breakfast and I regretted it all day. Those independent clauses have been joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Therefore, even though the sentence has a lot going on in it, it is still grammatically correct and it has been punctuated correctly. Here's another example. Although I was hungry, I decided to skip breakfast and I regretted it all day. So we have the exact same sentence, but what we've done here is we've blown it up a little bit so we can look at the parts. And you can see at first we start with that dependent clause, like I mentioned before, and we follow it with the comma. Then we have the independent clause, which is followed by a comma and a fanpoi. And then we have the final independent clause. Now today, we talked about clauses and phrases, we talked about complex sentences, we talked about compound complex sentences, and your key takeaway is that when you have a complex sentence, you need to first off watch out for subordinating conjunctions because they will signal dependent clauses. And when you have a dependent clause that starts your sentence followed by an independent clause, you need a comma between the two. But if you have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause, then you do not need a comma between the two. Thank you for watching today.